Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website, as well as those who are joining us on C-SPAN Network this morning. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And of course, we will post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Today's event is hosted by Heritage's B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics. The Simon Center focuses on teaching the foundations of liberty and the principles of the American political tradition to those who shape public opinion. Leading and welcoming our guest is Dr. David Azarad, Director of the Simon Center for Principles in Politics and AWC Family Foundation Fellow. David?
Good afternoon. The caliphate has fallen, Osama bin Laden is dead, but the threat of Islamic terror remains. Indeed, ISIS continues to direct or inspire attacks in the West, including the Halloween attack in New York and a string of atrocities in Europe. Its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has not yet been captured. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda remains active in Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen. Across the world, from France to Nigeria, Islamism continues to attract followers, and the threat of terror still looms. And while Western governments have made considerable progress in countering Islamic terrorism since the attacks of 9/11, confusion remains over the exact nature of the threat and the mindset of the jihadists. If we are to defeat this enemy, we must first learn to think like him. Sun Tzu's advice in The Art of War remains as true today as when he first wrote it down 2,500 years ago. Know yourself, know your enemy. In 100 battles, you will never be defeated. How then do terrorists think about strategy? More specifically, in what ways do they think about strategy differently than we do? How do they define winning? What do they fear most? To help us think through these important questions, we are very pleased to have here with us today at the Heritage Foundation, Professor Carl Walling. Through a careful study of terrorist organizations spanning the entire globe, Professor Walling has distilled the key lessons Americans must learn in order to defeat terrorism. Professor Walling teaches in the Department of War and Strategy at the United States Naval War College in Rhode Island. He previously served as an interrogator in the U.S. Army and has taught at Harvard University, Carleton College, the U.S. Air Force Academy, and Colorado College. Walling is the author of Republican Empire, Alexander Hamilton on War and Free Government, and the co-editor with Brad Lee of Strategic Logic and Political Rationality. He currently is writing a book on Thucydides and the history of the Peloponnesian War. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carl Walling.
Before I begin, I have to say this. Nothing in this talk reflects the official views of the United States Naval War College, the Department of the Navy, the Department of Defense, or any other government entity. In the handout I passed around, I have two quotations at the top. One is from Sun Tzu, know yourself, know your enemy. In 100 battles, you will never be defeated. That strikes me as a bit optimistic. Sometimes your enemy has so much superior force that it doesn't matter how much you know, you're still going to lose. But in most cases, knowledge of your strengths and weaknesses relative to your opponent are crucial components of devising a strategy. Those of you who know American football, or perhaps even played it, know that after a Sunday game or a Friday night game, if it's high school, you take a break and then you watch game film. You look at what you did well and what you did badly, your strengths and weaknesses, and then you look ahead to the next game, whatever film you can get on your upcoming opponent. And coaches do an assessment of in which they try to find a way to pit their strengths against an opponent's weaknesses and prevent an opponent from pitting strengths against their own weaknesses. This is the foundation of strategic thinking. an assessment first, know what kind of conflict you're getting into, and you have to do it before you construct a strategy. The second quotation I have is from one of my favorite French philosophers, Blaise Pascal, who says, "The ancient philosophers were most serious when they seemed most playful, and most playful when they seemed most serious." That is to say, play can be a very serious thing. At war colleges around the world, people play war games. Sometimes they're thought experiments, and just that. Sometimes what they're doing is they're testing hypotheses empirically by actually seeing what happens when you're out in the field. So play is an essential component of thinking strategically. You have to play before you fight. If you don't play before you fight, you may discover that you're not ready to fight. So I'm going to ask you all to play a game with me. And there's something mischievous about the game, even devilish. I want you to pretend that each one of you is a young terrorist, each one of you. And your superiors have identified in you talents that may enable you to rise in the command, such that you are no longer the kind of person who detonates a bomb, but someone who's in charge of the people who detonate bombs. Your job is to learn to think strategically about how to use terrorism. And here I need to stress something. I am not going to talk much, if at all, about the ideology that drives terrorists. Instead, I'm going to talk about, it's not working? All right, is this better? All right. Instead, I'm going to talk about the methodology of terrorism. And I'm going to base my talk on certain theories of war that have been taught for millennia and how terrorists adapt such theories of war to serve their strategic purposes. Now, so the key point here, when I say how to think like a terrorist, I'm saying how to think about how terrorists try to think strategically. So pretend that you are a young terrorist. Also pretend that I am your professor, and that this is the first day of Terrorism 101, your introduction to thinking about terrorism. When I say introduction, that means it's not terrorism 400. It's not terrorism 5,000. I'm not going to get into the most sophisticated ways of thinking about it. I'm going to lay out some of the fundamentals, because the more sophisticated approaches are all different ways of combining the fundamentals. Now, as a young terrorist, you study strategic theory the same way they do at other war colleges, and this is just a fact. You read your Clausewitz, you read your Sun Tzu, you read Mao Zedong, and you also look at historical cases of the successes and failures of terrorism. You want to find out what works and what doesn't work, so that you can be a more effective terrorist yourself. And there are 4 cases I'm going to draw on here today. The first is the Party of Socialist Revolutionaries in Russia from approximately 1895 to 1905. The second is the Irish Republican Army fighting against England from 1916 to 1923. The third is the Shining Path in Peru in the 1970s and 1980s. And the fourth is the FLN, the Algerian independence movement fighting against the French from approximately 1950 to 1963. What I'm looking at is what's common in these different approaches to strategy. What worked, what failed. Because we as terrorists, remember, we are terrorists in this thought experiment. We as terrorists want to know what works and what fails. We need to make a distinction between methodology and pathology. Plenty of people who join terrorist organizations are criminals. Some are nuts. But just because they're criminals or nuts doesn't mean that their bosses are irrational. We should give the terrorist leaders credit for being rational, at least until they prove themselves otherwise. And when I say rational, I mean about their methodology, not about their ideology. So I start by thinking about the rational use of violence. And the classic source for thinking about that is Karl von Clausewitz, who defines war as an act of violence to compel your adversary to do your will. The violence is not an end in itself. Instead, it's a means to achieve something else, your will, which is your political objective. So you're matching strategy to achieve whatever policy you have in mind. Terrorism is a species of war, I am going to argue today. That is to say, you can apply Clausewitzian logic to understand what terrorists are up to. It is premeditated violence against non-combatants to achieve political objectives. A common way of looking at terrorism at war colleges, where we look at it as a species of war. That means it's different from mere crime or even worse, insanity. The objectives are political. You're not trying to get rich. The objectives are political and range from compelling political reform to expelling an occupier to inciting a revolution. In our case, here at Terrorist U, inspiring a revolution throughout the Muslim world to restore the caliphate, unite the Ummah, the faithful, and impose Sharia law. Terrorism overlaps frequently with insurgency, but is not identical to it. Here I have to borrow from a very famous theorist of insurgency, Mao Zedong. You have to understand about Mao Zedong. In the 1920s, he hangs around with 20 guys who found the Chinese Communist Party. It's really a bunch of frat boys. And the question before them is, how do we take over all of China? What will be our strategy to do so? Please note, Mao succeeded. So there might be something to learn from Mao about how to take over an entire country. And he developed a three-phased theory of war. The first phase is called the strategic defensive. The terrorists have no money, they have no weapons, and they need to get both. In particular, what they need to get is recruits. And so terrorism is a recruiting tool for them. You blow up, kill hated figures of authority, and young, angry people say, I want to be like those guys. I want to join the organization. The second phase, and by the way, in this first phase, it's primarily terrorism. In the second phase, it's much more organized insurgency. You've acquired weapons, you've acquired money, you begin to develop a base, sanctuaries where you can train and discipline your folks. Terrorism's still part of the strategy, but it's less important. And in the third phase, you manage to transition to conventional warfare as your opponent has grown weaker and weaker. You're still using terrorism, but the conventional dimension is much more important. When you think about the Islamic State, Daesh, in 2014, they shocked the world. Yeah, they'd been conducting terrorist activity in Iraq, but they were very low level. During the surge, we thought we'd crush them. No, they'd just gone underground. But in 2014, they captured the city of Mosul. A bunch of guys in pickup trucks routing the Iraqi army, equipped with the most modern American equipment. Shocking. And then they captured that equipment. And that means they were able to move from stage 1 to at least stage 2 of Mao's theory, and they were hoping to go all the way to stage 3. Hint, hint. If you're working the counter-terrorist approach, you don't want your opponent to get beyond stage 1, all right? That's one way of thinking about counter-terrorist strategy. Don't let them get beyond stage one. Don't let it rise to the level of an organized insurgency. Certainly don't allow them to have a state where they can practice conventional warfare. But I should point out that not all terrorists are able to follow the Maoist model. Some can never get beyond stage one. And occasionally, not frequently, the terrorists still manage to achieve their objectives by staying, relying simply on terrorism. In other words, what I've been trying to say to you is there's a real method to the apparent madness of terrorism. Terrorism is commonly called the strategy of the weak. Look, if you had an army, if you had a state, you wouldn't resort to terrorism because you could achieve your means, your goals through conventional means. But there's a wonderful story about the Indian ambassador to the United States after the first Gulf War, saying, what's the lesson of the first Gulf War? He says, don't fight the United States without nuclear weapons. I would modify that story and say, don't fight the United States on its own terms. There is no military in the world today that can beat the United States in a conventional war. Therefore, you're either going to need to escalate towards nuclear weapons, which explains why some people are trying to acquire them, whether in North Korea, Iran, or elsewhere. Or if you can't win by the rules, you know what you do? Change the rules. Don't play by the rules of conventional warfare. Practice terrorism. So you can escalate up or you can ratchet down. Note, what this means is war is alive. War does not remain constant. It's always changing its form. That's why Sun Tzu compared it to water that can be like, it can be a solid, a liquid, or a gas. And just when you thought you were on top of it and that nobody could beat you, they just change form and do something else. All right, so there's a method to this apparent madness. Terrorism, I've said, is the strategy of the weak. They can't win by conventional means, so they seek other means. How do they do it? If you can't beat your opponent force on force, you can still win. Said Clausewitz, strength is force multiplied by will, or more largely what he called the moral factors, the intangibles that go into war, like leadership, training, discipline, not to mention strategy, which is also an intangible. If you can't beat your opponent's force, defeat his mind. Let me say that again. If you can't beat your opponent's force, defeat his mind. And so terrorism is a strategy of the weak who manipulate the minds and political systems of their supporters, neutrals and enemies, to get what they want. There's a famous saying from the Party of Socialist Revolutionaries that terrorism is about the propaganda of the deed. Please note, it is a marketing strategy. You are trying to sell your cause to others, and you do it through deeds. This cause is worth so much that I am willing not only to kill innocent people, but to kill myself on behalf of it. Spreading the gospel of the cause, propaganda of the deed. So in that sense, terrorism is trying to work on the minds of those who might support it, not merely of adversaries. By now, you might have guessed where I'm going. I'm saying that terrorism is political theater. And in political theater, you always have to worry about your audiences. And I know a lot of you folks work up on the Hill, and political theater, apparently it goes on in Washington as well. And you should think about the audiences of the theater. And I'm going to say there are five primary audiences for terrorist violence. Who are they? The first audience is their adversary's government. You're sending a message to them. And what message might that be? Well, namely, the government cannot win. Give you an example. You want to intimidate anyone from supporting the government so it is unable to exert its authority. Classic example, Ireland The British maintained control in Ireland through police garrisons throughout the island. What the IRA did is they'd follow a policeman home from work and they'd kill him. And they'd hang a sign around him saying, "This is what happens to traitors." Do that enough times and you get a case of the blue flu. Police stop showing up for work. And what good are police stations without policemen? And the IRA filled the vacuum. It created its own police force, its own courts. And of course, it was, if you were supporting the British, you went to court. The IRA did not deal kindly with you. So the violence there is directed at anyone who might support the government. Another way of doing this is to raise costs to the government, so it loses the will to fight. This is very important if you want to understand war in general and terrorism as a species of war. When you go to war, you always have a political objective, or rather, you better have a political objective, because says Clausewitz, no one in his right mind goes to war without knowing what it is they're trying to accomplish and how. Well, every objective has some value. You can keep fighting until the costs reach that value. But once costs exceed the value of the objective you're fighting for, the rational thing to do is make peace. Right? That's the rational thing to do. You don't throw good money after bad. So maybe you can raise costs to the government such that it says it's no longer worth it. You know, the old argument is it cost Al-Qaeda approximately $1 million for the terrorist attack on 9/11. Ask yourself how much money we've paid. All right? A strategy of protracted war, raising costs in time and effort until people say, "I just don't want to do this anymore," exhausting your opponent. Said Sun Tzu, no state has ever benefited from a protracted war. Well, if a state does not benefit from a protracted war, who might? Maybe those who don't have a state yet, the non-state actor. Another dimension of this is you really want to provoke the government to overreact. That's an interesting question. One way of talking about it is you want to draw a foul. You know, those of you who watch soccer, a soccer player, you puff in his general direction. He falls on the ground. He acts like you just crippled him, trying to get the referees to throw one of those cards. You draw a foul. In other words, you're putting on theater for the referee. You can think the same way about certain acts of terrorist violence, that you do something horrendous and despicable, counting that you will make your opponent so angry that it will react in an equally or even worse appalling and despicable manner, because you're playing for the sympathy of the people here. A good example of that, by the way, is from the Algerian War for Independence. In order to ignite that war, the FLN terrorist organization conducted a horrible massacre in the town of Philippeville. And I mean really horrible. They were killing people indiscriminately, right and left. They killed a pregnant woman. They cut open her womb, pulled out the fetus, and then stuck the womb on top of her. They nailed dead babies to walls. Why would anybody do something like that? Because they were trying to make the French angry, trying to make French colonials angry. So angry that they would respond in an equally appalling manner. So the French colonials went on a riot through Muslim villages, killing indiscriminately. And the French Navy bombarded Muslim villages from the sea. And French bombers hit those villages too. Now, what does that mean? Unintentionally, the French wound up being recruiters for the FLN. Their willingness to inflict collateral damage upon innocents fed into the narrative, the story the FLN was trying to sell of being exploited by the French. And in the process, the French delegitimized themselves in this struggle. If you think about it that way, terrorism is a kind of political judo. Remember, they're not strong. When you're not strong, what do? Use your opponent's strength against him. Political judo. Now, another audience for terrorism, surprisingly, is terrorists themselves. The theater is put on for them. Why? Well, remember, you are all young terrorists here. You know, you've been hiding out in caves. You've not had much to eat. You know, when you get to eat, it's often grub worms. This is not good for morale. You have to sustain morale of people who are willing to join the organization. And how do you do that? You get a victory every once in a while. Those of you who own stock know that you'd like to get a dividend, some return on your investment every once in a while. Because if you don't get a return, the logical thing to do is to sell the stock or no longer support the organization. But if you can get little victories every once in a while, people say, I'll hold on to the stock. I'll keep supporting this cause because it may be a growth stock. There may be big return on the individual investment I have made. Another way in which terrorists are the audience of terrorism is you have discipline problems. Let's face it, the kind of people who are willing to join these organizations are often kind of angry, loose cannons. You want to make sure that they follow your strategy, that they're not killing indiscriminately. And when I use the term indiscriminately, I mean in a manner that's not consistent with your strategy. You don't want them taking control of the operation. And so if in any way they violate orders, discipline them. Kill them, right? Kill them to set an example to other terrorists. And sometimes what's going on is there are rival terrorist organizations competing for popular support. You don't want look, if you're a member of the Bloods, you don't want the Crips to gain, right? If you were a member of the FLN, you did not want its rival organization, the MLA, to gain. So the FLN in Algeria, while they were fighting the French, were also fighting this rival terrorist organization. Now, another audience for terrorism is what's called the constituent population, sometimes known as friends. By the way, I said constituent population. I do that deliberately to set you up to understand that terrorism has a lot to do with what we in America call election politics. You want people to vote. You want them to vote for your side and against the other side. Whereas we in America use editorials and speeches and social media to persuade. What's going on with terrorists is you're using bombs and guns, but you're trying to make them make a choice. In that sense, it's a kind of violent election. Well, about the constituent population, or what we today in America would call your base. What is the message you were trying to send to your base? Well, they too could be depressed, so it's good for morale. If you succeed, you might attract recruits. If you are successful operationally, you might gain financial support. One impact of 9/11, even though Al-Qaeda lost its base in Afghanistan, is recruiting went way up for Al-Qaeda. And so too did financial support for the organization. So in that way, it was a way of appealing to those who were naturally sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. Another audience is what's called the non-constituent population. I'd call them the neutrals, or if I were to compare it to American politics, those who are neither Democrats nor Republicans, but the independents. You're sending them a message too, namely, you're with us or against us. There will be no neutrals in this conflict. I know you're sitting around singing all you're saying is give peace a chance. I know that you have been listening to John Lennon talking about Imagine. You want peace, you want a compromise. Sorry. No, 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 no. That will not work. The first people to die frequently where terrorism gets out of control is the neutrals. The ones who are trying to say, why can't we all just get along? Why can't we reason with each other? And the reason is they're getting shot at from both sides, the terrorists and the counter-terrorists. The terrorists do not want neutrals because they give people an alternative way of achieving their objectives through the political system. A final audience for terrorism is international opinion. What you want to do is get your issue on the international agenda. Just think about international politics today. So many different issues. Are we going to focus on trade? Are we going to focus on the environment? Are we going to focus on nuclear proliferation? Are we going to focus on global climate change? There's only 24 hours in the day. There are opportunity costs to investing in any one of these struggles. So you want people to make your issue their priority. Your issue is the one that international organizations and leaders should focus upon. And a good example of this, again, is the FLN and the Algerian War for Independence. Terrorist violence against the French, and then the French counter-violence, which was equally atrocious and involved torture. It was the French becoming like the Gestapo. Imagine that, 15 years after World War II, the French are imitating the Gestapo against the terrorists in Algeria. Well, this looked horrific to the rest of the world. And eventually a young senator from Massachusetts got up and made a speech in the Senate saying that what the French are doing is despicable, that they're on the wrong side of history, that they should grant the Algerians independence. And then that young senator, John F. Kennedy, became president. At that moment, the handwriting was on the wall for the French. You want American support? Get rid of Algeria. Right? You want American support? Get rid of Algeria. So in that sense, playing to international opinion was very helpful for the FLN. Now, if you have not figured this out already, it should become perfectly clear to you that the media are a crucial battlefield in this. Because if an act of terror occurs and there's no cameras around to show it, what significance does it have? Your message does not get out. So we have to think about the role of media and how terrorists try to manipulate the media to achieve their objectives. As I've said before, I see terrorism as trying to produce a violent election in manipulating the minds of these different audiences. At this point, I should note an incredible irony. There is enormous overlap between strategies of terrorism and strategies of non-violent civil disobedience. In other words, I'm saying that the strategies of Al-Qaeda overlap with the strategies of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And that's a real irony. Think it through for a moment. Al-Qaeda willing to use violence beyond the pale. Martin Luther King and Gandhi renouncing violence under any circumstances. How could any sober person, and I haven't drunk today, how could any sober person say that there's an overlap in the strategies? And the answer has to do with the media and above all, this business of provoking overreactions in order to create martyrs. Think back to the American Civil Rights Movement for a moment. Think of the March on Selma. Think of the confrontation between the police and the nonviolent protesters at the bridge at Selma. Think of the beatings they took. Think of Bull Connor turning fire hoses on the protesters, and film of German shepherds going at people's throats. Think of film of people trying to sit in restaurants and get a meal, and vigilantes beating them up. The key thing here is film. If you have it on tape, you can broadcast it to the entire country. And who looks better? The people beating them up, or the ones who have the self-discipline to take it? Now note what happens. You create martyrs this way. People's sympathy goes towards the protesters, and that helps them recruit. And it helps delegitimize the actions of the government. And by the way, if my family was very involved in the civil rights movement, martyrs aren't a bad thing. I know there's some people who are kind of kooky and actually want to be martyrs. That may say something about them individually as personalities. But from the standpoint of the cause, having martyrs is a really good thing. From the standpoint of the success of the American Civil Rights Movement, it's a horrible thing that Dr. King was assassinated. But from the standpoint of the success of that movement, his assassination was very helpful. So I'm saying there is some overlap here, and it's because you need the media, and because the same audiences for terrorism, by the way, are the same audiences for nonviolent civil disobedience. And I know a lot of you folks here, you're working on the Hill and whatever, you're always thinking about audiences and messaging. So these things I'm talking to you about should be reasonably familiar. When it comes to terrorists, it's rooted in a political psychology. That's a fancy term for how you understand human nature. I think the most useful source for thinking about it is Niccolo Machiavelli, who developed a political psychology based on three passions: fear, love, and hate. Fear, love, and hate. Remember, this is a violent election. You want to motivate your base with appeals either to love for your cause or hatred of the other guy's cause. Then there are those neutrals or the independents out there. Well, you'd like to pull them to your cause by getting them to love it. But if that doesn't work, just get them to hate the other guy's cause more. And that may help you. And by the way, make sure they're afraid to get in your way. And then finally, there's your opponent's base. And you want to marginalize them. You want to strip them of as many supporters as possible by intimidating them. Now, all of this means that competing narratives, competing stories are crucial to marginalize your adversaries, mobilize your constituents, and compel neutrals to pick sides. So remember, this is terrorist war college. Outside of the war college, never call yourself a terrorist. You're a holy warrior. You are a holy warrior. You are a freedom fighter from the oppression of the Crusaders. You draw attention to the cause you were fighting for, not to the means by which you fight it. By the way, the counter-terrorist is going to do just the opposite. Call attention to the means by which you fight in order to undermine your cause. There's a danger in terrorist use of the media, however, and it's what I'd call desensitizing. Look, relative to Israel and Palestine, terrorism's going on for a long, long time. In the 70s, it might have been shocking if, a Palestinian knifed an Israeli or vice versa. But that became common. And you pick up the newspaper and you say, oh, there was a terrorist attack in Israel today. Well, that's not news. It happens all the time. And so if you're a terrorist, you're trying to get attention. If these small acts of violence don't work, you escalate to bigger ones. You kill people at the Olympics. And if that's not working, you got to escalate to a bigger one. I know, let's fly some airplanes into some tall buildings. That might get people's attention. So there's a kind of escalatory dynamic here that is linked to the media campaign. I would point out that open are often more vulnerable than closed societies to terrorism. Think of the Russians in Chechnya, for example. They're fighting Al-Qaeda too, and a really nasty version of it. But it's hard to get information about what's going on in Chechnya. That's because the Russians won't let the media in. I'm pretty sure what the Russians have done in Chechnya is appalling. All right? But because terrorist strategies depend upon use of the media, by shutting out the media, the Russians have better odds of defeating it, I'm afraid to say, than those in free societies. In free societies, the media will be everywhere. And it's the price of freedom that we will be more vulnerable than closed societies. Another consideration is message trade-offs. And you folks here at Heritage know this, all right? A speech that appeals to one audience completely turns off another audience. I mean, that's sort of poli-sci 101. And so when you're messaging, you got to calibrate how you're going to do the messaging. And some things that may look simply irrational to us in America make really good sense if you pay attention to the audience for which this theater is directed. Some of you may remember 3 years ago, there was a poor Jordanian officer captured by the Islamic State who was burnt alive in a cage. Turn off for us. But imagine you're a young, angry guy who really wants to stick it to the Crusaders. Oh my God. I want to join ISIS, man. I want to do the same thing. Give me a chance. I want to burn somebody alive in a cage too. All right? So, yeah, turns off one audience, but turns on another. And if you're a terrorist strategist, you have to say, well, what's the risk factor here? Oh, this could really provoke people to react against me, but it might help me with recruiting, which is more important to me at the time. All right, I'm going to say a few things about how terrorists win and make some suggestions about how the counter-terrorists might defeat them. How do they win? We should know this in America. Americans should know this, the conditions that enable terrorists to win. But I have to define victory. All right? Victory is achieving your political objectives. How do terrorists achieve their political objectives? Well, frequently they sell their violence as part of a struggle for national liberation. It's one of the most common sources of terrorist success. If you can say this is about freedom, whether from an empire or from an authoritarian regime or from American imperialism or from religious oppression, if you can sell the story that way, your odds of success go way up. Because throughout history, it's been shown that people have been willing to pay a great price and take great risks on behalf of what they consider to be freedom. It helps if you can attack while your enemy is exhausted and overextended. This is why the British had to cave into the IRA. After World War I, they're tired. They're building their empire in the Middle East. They just have too few resources to address it. Superior intelligence and counterintelligence are crucial to successful terrorist strategies. And here I'm going to tell you a story about Michael Collins, who was the general in charge of the IRA while fighting the British to achieve the independence of Ireland. Collins managed to plant a mole inside of British intelligence headquarters in Dublin. Now, what did the mole do? Well, the first thing he did was, on Collins's orders, was go into the intelligence files and find Collins' file and make sure it disappeared. So the British didn't know who Collins was. They didn't know that he was running the IRA. And so Collins would ride around Dublin on a bicycle past British military checkpoints, say, hey, how you guys going? By the way, go get them terrorists, would you? Go get them terrorists. Have a nice day. And the British had no clue that that's what he was doing. The other thing Collins did is he had the mole give him the identity of every British intelligence officer in Ireland. And he then arranged for every one of those officers to be killed on the same day at the same hour. As a result, he knew everything about what the British were doing. The British were clueless about what he was doing. By the way, I do not get royalties from Netflix, but there's a film about Michael Collins entitled Michael Collins that you could, stream if you wish. And it's a good film to see with your partner, because not only is it about violence, which seems to turn on one kind of partner, but it's got romance. There's a female heroine. Julia Roberts is the female lead, and Liam Neeson is playing Michael Collins. So if you want to learn more about terrorist strategy, Terrorism 201, go rent that film. Again, I've mentioned provoking your adversary to overreact. It really helps to gain sanctuaries, a place where your opponent can't reach you. Examples today would be Sudan, portions of Afghanistan, Yemen. Ideal sanctuaries for terrorists are failed or failing states, places where the long arm of the government does not reach, like Detroit. No, but places where you can build up your base. Perhaps most important, I think, for successful terrorist strategies, especially when they morph into strategies of insurgency, is to raise costs in a protracted struggle until the adversary says it is no longer worth fighting. Look, many of my students have done 5, 6, some 12 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. The ones who come back from Afghanistan always cite this line from the Taliban. You Americans, you got the watches, but we got the time. They have the technology. We have the technology. And that gives us an advantage. But it means more to them, probably, than us, or that's their gamble. The struggle means more to them in Afghanistan than it does to us. And so if they have the patience, if they have the endurance, they can wait us out, and they can shorten the amount of time we are willing to spend in the conflict by keeping up a low-level protracted war that raises the costs until we say we are fed up. I'm looking at the clock. I give versions of this talk around the country. Some are 60 minutes long. I decided I'd go 40 minutes for the sake of audience involvement. So I've said something about how terrorists win. Know yourself, know your enemy. Presuming we know something about how terrorist strategy works, it's time to think about how you turn the tables on your opponent, how you might develop a counter-terrorist strategy. This is something that we at Terrorist War College have to worry about. What if we faced an intelligent opponent who actually understood our game? What would an intelligent opponent who understands our game do to fight against us? Here I have recourse to Sun Tzu. Look, in strategy, everything old is new again. I know he wrote 2,500 years ago, but all new strategies are basically modifications, different combinations of some old principles. Said Sun Tzu, the best strategy is to attack your enemy's strategy. Assume that's right. If our strategy as terrorists is to provoke overreactions, if that is our strategy, then the logical thing for the counter-terrorist to do is not overreact, all right? Don't overreact. You know they want you to overreact, so don't. You have to practice self-restraint. Here's the downside. It has to do often with domestic politics. Self-restraint will look like weakness at home. And so political leaders are going to be calibrating here. If I practice self-restraint, it may help me strategically, but harm me politically. Said Sun Tzu, the next best strategy is to attack your opponent's alliances. Time-tested strategy, divide and conquer. You have to understand Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, they're coalitions. Let me stress that again, they are coalitions. Yes, you have Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, some in Pakistan, some in Libya, some in the Maghreb. They're all over the place. ISIS is in different countries as well. But the local actors have local loyalties. Let me say that again. Local actors have local loyalties. And so you can have a tension between your local loyalty and your loyalty to the larger organization and its ideology. My suggestion is over time, the local loyalties are more likely to triumph than the cosmopolitan transnational ones. And my source for thinking about this is George Kennan, writing early during the Cold War, when Americans thought they were facing monolithic international communism directed from the Kremlin. He said, well, right now they're loyal to the Kremlin, but this cannot last. Eventually, national loyalty will trump international communist solidarity. And he said, it's going to happen in Yugoslavia, just a matter of time. And he was right. The Yugoslavians broke away. And he said, it's going to happen in China. Chinese nationalism will trump international communist solidarity. So what I'm pointing to is there are fractures in the system. These guys are not guaranteed to be allies at all. And what you want to do is if you know there's a crack, you want to stick a wedge in there and crack it open as far as possible. Divide these guys into little organizations who are unable to coordinate effectively. Said Sun Tzu, the third best strategy is to attack your enemy's military. What does that mean for the counter-terrorists today? You want to keep your objectives very limited to Al-Qaeda, ISIS fighters. You want very, very strict rules of engagement. No collateral damage, because that helps create martyrs for the cause. You do not want to use violence in such a manner that your opponent is using you to recruit new people to his side. So it's going to require incredible discipline, focusing on the opponent's fighters and avoiding collateral damage. I should point out, by the way, it's not easy to defeat a terrorist organization, but it can be done. What's harder is to defeat the ideology. How do you kill an idea? My suggestion is you're not going to kill the idea. That the best you're going to be able to do is marginalize it so that fewer and fewer people are willing to support it. And in order to do that, that requires incredible discipline on the part of the counter-terrorists. Said Sun Tzu, the worst strategy is to attack cities and get tied down in protracted wars of attrition. No state, he says, has ever benefited from a protracted war. That being the case, you do not want to get involved in protracted wars like the war in Iraq again. That would be the worst thing you could do from the standpoint of counterterrorism. That means what you would focus on is what's called light footprint strategies. And the American military is already moving in this direction. You don't want hundreds of thousands of troops in a country. You want special forces, small groups of them, trainers, highly skilled, barely noticed by the society in which they live. Because the bigger the American presence, the more the adversary might be able to say the Americans are imperialists dominating us, et cetera, et cetera. So you go light, very, very light. Now, I would also point out that if this is political theater, if messaging and the media are really crucial, you have to ask yourself, who is the best messenger on the part of the counter-terrorists? My argument is it's not Americans. It's not anyone from the West. With respect to Islamist terrorism, the best messengers are other Muslims themselves. The best way to defeat the ideology by marginalizing it is to get other Muslims to stand up and say, no, this is not what Islam enjoins. No, this is not true Islam. The more you get people to say that, the better off you are. Therefore, I would argue under no circumstance, ever, ever, ever portray our struggle with the terrorist organization with a struggle with Islam itself. There are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world today. We do not need 1.5 billion enemies. Now that leads me to say something about how this struggle might end. And to understand that, you have to be able to define victory. I don't think you're going to get rid of the idea. It'll be like one of those diseases, malaria. It comes, it goes, it comes, it goes. Or it can be like diabetes. Diabetes is a condition that we have no cure for, but you can manage it. Let me say that again. You can manage it. You can reduce terrorism to a nuisance level. That would be my definition of victory, such that, yeah, terrorist attacks occur once or twice a year. If that's all that happens and the violence is limited to very, very few people, free society in America will keep on going like the ever-ready battery. Keep on going and going and going. And remember, victory here does not mean no casualties. It means minimizing them and making sure that we preserve our own free way of life. Everyone should note that there have been relatively few terrorist attacks in the United States since 9/11. Yes, there have been some. There'll probably be a few every year for as far into the future as anyone can see. That does not mean we're losing. Remember, they want to provoke us to overreact, and we have to keep our heads. In other words, I think we're doing pretty well. It's not because of the war in Iraq. The relatively few terrorist acts that have been committed in the United States since 9/11 really have a lot more to do with the cooperation of different government agencies, CIA, FBI, police forces, than anything else. And if that is true, if that cooperation of our intelligence and police forces has been the primary source of our security, then this may be war. Indeed, I think it is war. But it's a different kind of war, and it's one in which the military may be the least relevant tool of success, and intelligence and police forces the most useful tools. Now that, like much that I've said, is somewhat controversial. I forgot to bring a shield, but if you want to throw things, I'll take whatever you have. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Nathaniel. I'm an intern here at the Heritage Foundation. When you talk about not killing the idea, but instead marginalizing the idea, and the need to rely on Muslims to carry out that duty as opposed to the West, how do you balance that prescription with the fact that the most prominent and affluent Muslim-majority countries in the world not only refuse to deride these ideas, but instead actively encourage and support them instead?
Well, Islam is diverse. We should avoid black and white categorizations of Islam as a whole. 1.5 billion different kinds of Muslims around the world, some practicing very, very peaceful, almost pacifistic versions of Islam, some subscribers to much more austere, puritanical, and violent forms. It's true that in some parts of the Gulf, some very rich people have given a lot of money to very extreme versions of Islam, and some of that money winds up in terrorist hands. My argument here is that what you really need to be thinking about is not the Well, you have to look at both. You got to look at people who are willing to give money, rich people, if you wish, the Koch brothers of Saudi Arabia, if there's such an equivalent, or if you don't like that one, the George Soroses. You got to look not merely at those who are giving money, but at the religious leadership. Are there religious leaders willing to stand up to those who practice terrorism? It was about a year ago where the Grand Mufti, I think it's in Egypt, issued a fatwa saying that terrorism is un-Islamic and that those who practice it are not true Muslims. You want not one mufti to say that, but 100. Oh, why settle for 100 muftis? You want 1,000 muftis on your side. The more you can do to get people to say that, the better off you are. But please note the delicate problem here. Here's my solution. I know. Let's send AID aid to muftis around the world. How's it going to look for them if we give them money? All right. We have just delegitimized them and essentially turned them into targets for those who practice terrorism. So as a result, while you know, and this often happens in strategy, you know what you must do to win, but you're not sure how to get there. All right? I'm going to say that. Victory here is when religious leaders throughout the Muslim world turn on and denounce terrorists such that people would say no good Muslim can be a terrorist. If that happens, you win. The question is, how do you make it happen? And my answer is light footprint and indirection with tons and tons and tons of plausible deniability. That would be a beginning there. Wow. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. My name is Cammy, but I was listening to you on C-SPAN on my phone while I was in Uber. I'm a Muslim. My name is Mohammed, as a matter of fact. And my family was too poor in Pakistan, so I went to madrasa before I went to high school for
Just a second here.
education.
English is great, but you're speaking so quickly.
Okay, because I'm emotional.
I hear you, so if you just slow down a little bit.
Okay. So my question is this, that how West can help Muslim countries or Muslim communities, after all, Trump is very close to Saudi Arabia, to change the interpretation of the Quran ayat or Qurani, surah, whatever you call it, because basically these things are very related with Old Testament. I'm sure you know Abraham, Ishmael, Hagar, Sarah, you know those stories, but they are very related. The difference is only this, that Muslims tend to take those things in very literal sense, and in the West, we take as a, not very seriously. I wouldn't say that we take as a joke, but in West, we don't take it very seriously. So my friend in grade school, Kafayatullah, he joined Lashkar-e-Taiba. I happened to, came here and I studied here, but I see no difference, absolutely no difference the way Kafayatullah was raised or I was raised in Pakistan, because I can make a comparison between Kafayatullah's family, who was part of Lashkar-e-Taiba, and as you know, Lashkar-e-Taiba is a terrorist organization in Department of State's books. But there is no difference between Kafayatullah and average Mormon family in America, except that average Mormon family has nothing to do with terrorism. They don't teach their children these kind of things. But I'm sure that if people turned against Mormon in this country, Mormon would behave or react the same way like these Muslims do. Thanks.
Sir, I suspect you're right. The issue is how Islam is interpreted. I am not an Islamic scholar. In fact, everybody should know this. I'm a fraud. Seriously. I'm applying for a job at Heritage where I might be a fellow in American political thought, which is my specialty. somehow, talking to folks here, they said, why don't you give us a talk on terrorism? You teach it every once in a while. I said, all right, I'll give you a talk on terrorism, but it's really American political thought that I'm interested in. Having acknowledged the absurdity of this situation, but I do occasionally teach courses on terrorism as part of my job. Let me say I'm not an Islamic scholar of Islam, but I think it's entirely logical, sir, to say that the issue is how Islam is interpreted. Well, then there are teachers of interpretation. Change the minds of the teachers, and you can eventually change the interpretation. Everybody gets that. The question is, how do we change the minds of the teachers? And my suggestion is probably not with bombs. All right, probably not with bombs. Military force can disrupt these organizations, can make it difficult for them to operate, but it's not going to change people's minds. Okay, we came to an end. Thank you all for having me here.